Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, which is all around the umbrella reforms. And now we've got the final finance bill available. We can have a little bit of a deep dive and go through the legislation and hopefully dispel some of the myths that are still out there in the market. We're expecting a fairly sizable audience, so we will wait a couple of seconds just to make sure everyone's had an opportunity to join before we kick off. We'll run through a number of topics, the last one of which will be a Q&A session. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions that you guys might have. So please do use the Q&A button at the top of your screen and submit your questions as we go through. And I'll make sure that we'll leave plenty of time for Francis and I to cover those off. It looks like the numbers that are joining are starting to slow, so I think we're in a good position to get started. So good afternoon, welcome to today's webinar hosted by Giant Group and Osborne Clarke, where we're going to look through the umbrella reforms now that we have the final legislation available and the impact that this is going to have on the contingent workforce market from April next year and onwards. Delighted today to be joined by Francis from Osborne Clarke. Francis, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, and hello to everybody on the webinar. I can see there's quite a few of you. So thanks for giving up your time this time of year and joining us for this session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Frances Lewis and I'm head of the Contingent Workforce Advisory Team at Osborne Clarke, and we have spent many years specialising in advising on staffing supply chain issues and all legal issues, including tax, of course, relating to contingent workers and staffing supply chains. So this is one of the areas that we're involved in, and clearly a lot of our clients are going to be affected by.
Thanks, Francis. Yeah, and I'm Dan Haslam. I'm Chief Business Development Officer for Giant. So I'll be the host for today. Giant is a contingent workforce management business. We are a well-recognised umbrella company in the UK as well, and we operate globally. So I'll be the host, and the plan is what we've got is a few set questions that I'll run through with Francis so she can go into detail on the topics. Topics that we've got fleshed out for today is the final legislation. Now it's out. What are the changes that we've seen from the drafts? So we'll call that out first. We'll then move on to the implications. So what are the wider implications of the legislation? So not just about scenarios where joint and several liability could occur, but also how might this have a wider impact on other commercial areas such as funding availability and insurance. We'll then move on to practical steps. So what should companies be thinking about? What should they be doing now to prepare? And then last topic is we'll just touch on the wider employment rights bill, because there's still a bit of confusion, I think, on what's happening there. And we'll talk through, what we know and then what the timeframes are around the employment rights bill, and then move on lastly to Q&A. So I think just generally speaking, even at this stage, there's still quite a spread, shall we say, of understanding out there of people and businesses trying to understand what the impact is of the legislation and how they can mitigate those risks. One thing to say right from the get-go is being really clear, there is no statutory defence to this joint and several liability, but there are ways that you can look to mitigate the risk, and Francis will help run through some of those today. So let's get cracking then, Francis, and move into our first topic. And that topic is looking at how, now that we've got the final draft, how has it changed? So could you just walk us through the final bill and highlight any amendments or additions compared to what we saw in the draft, please?
Okay, so in summary, the final legislation is largely unchanged. So all of the key features of the draft that was published back in July continue to apply. So there is still joint and several liability between the relevant parties, and that's in most cases going to be between what we call the top agency and the umbrella company, but clearly there are variations on that position depending on whether or not there's an agency in the supply chain, whether the agency is registered offshore or whether there's connection between the agency and the umbrella company. And in each of those cases, the joint several liability would be between what we're calling the end client and the umbrella company. The joint several liability is going to also be affected by the new concept that was introduced in July of purported umbrella companies. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but generally speaking, it's still joint and several liability between relevant parties in a supply chain. There's also, as Dan says, still strict liability. What does that mean? It means that there will be no statutory defence or excuse if something triggers joint and several liability for any tax default. So there would be any non-payment of PAYE and or NICs that are due in relation to payments to workers that have been supplied through to clients to provide their personal service. So even if an agency or an end user, if they're liable, has carried out due diligence checks, whether they be payslip checks or industry accreditations, both of which are useful, but they do not solve the problem, do not make the liability or the risk of liability go away. They will go some ways to try and establish whether or not you're dealing with an umbrella company that operates a compliant payroll, but they do not guarantee that joint and several liability will not be triggered. So they are not the solution to this, they're part of the solution. And even if you've carried out checks, they don't provide a defence if there is, unfortunately, liability. In all of this, we're talking about, worst case scenarios, because in a lot of cases where you're dealing with reputable, well-established umbrella companies, the risk is going to be low anyway, because they're not doing anything they shouldn't be doing. But therein lies the need for carrying out checks to make sure that you are stamping out use of the obvious bad players. So strict liability, but still worth doing the checks to make sure you're,
Francis,
as far as possible, dealing with reputable umbrella companies that are doing the right thing, not the wrong thing.
Yeah, agreed. Francis, just to add to that as well, and I know we'll cover it off in more detail as well, but also be clear, joint and several liability can occur where there's been a non-payment of tax to HMRC, which could be because of non-compliant behaviour, but it could also be as a result of a business failure, an insolvency with an umbrella company. So, of course, compliance checks are great, but they're not going to protect on the financial point, and obviously we'll move on to talk about that as well. So I just wanted to make sure we reinforce that here.
Yeah, and I think that that's very true, Dan, and I think that's probably going to be the biggest challenge, making sure you're not getting into a set of arrangements that could for some reason be compromised by a large debt or historic tax liability, something that puts the umbrella company into PAYE default. You're right, it doesn't have to be, because they're doing something dodgy, and obviously a payslip check wouldn't necessarily pick that up, or if it did, it wouldn't pick it up soon enough.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to mention before we move on is that the other key thing is that there's still this wide definition of what is an umbrella company. So it is wider than just companies that identify as umbrella companies or sell themselves as umbrella companies. It is a lot wider than that. So it's anybody who is providing people who are going to provide their personal service to a client, and there are a few other tests, but that's sort of broadly speaking what it means. So it is going to affect any arrangement where you've got one entity or company that employs individuals to then supply or second them to a client. That's much wider than maybe it was first appreciated, and that needs to be factored into any review of what is an umbrella company and what isn't. And then of course we've got the purported umbrella company extension, which is just a little bit more complex.
Pretty widely defined. Just to pause at that second, Graham, thanks for flagging. I believe some of you guys might be struggling to access the Q&A function, which is so fine. If you want to put questions across, if you just put them into the chat, then I'll make sure that we work through those as we go through the session. So use the chat function if you're struggling. Okay, so in terms of moving on then, the final legislation, Francis, obviously does include these additional examples now within the definition of a purported umbrella company. So it'd be good if you can try and help and clarify the types of engagements that could be caught here. It's not just traditional umbrella models, is it?
That's right, Dan. I mean, this is the main thing that's changed in the final legislations. There's a little bit more detail around this, and it is essentially these are the anti-avoidance rules within the new umbrella legislation. They're not called that, but that's essentially what they are. And what they broadly do, and I'm saying broadly because these are slightly complicated. I mean, I've sort of sat with a wet towel on my head trying to work through how and when they could apply. And they cover a range of scenarios, but the legislation breaks it down into what they call 3 cases. So the first one is where you have a situation where someone reasonably assumes that a person employs an individual, or where a person has taken steps to give the impression that they are the employer. So that will be generally a situation where you've got a company that possibly holds itself out as acting as an umbrella company or sells itself as such, but in fact is actually paying workers through arrangements that are not a PAYE payroll, for instance, through personal service companies or possibly as sole traders. So that's the first case. The second case is completely new. This wasn't in the original draft at all. But what this essentially seems to be doing is saying, okay, in a situation where the agency tax rules would otherwise have applied to the supply of the worker, where that agency under those rules has not provided work finding services to that worker in relation to the role, the agency tax rules won't apply, but the new umbrella tax legislation will. And that probably sounds a little bit hard to decipher, but it is effectively saying that where you've got an arrangement in a supply chain where someone's asked to basically payroll workers who they've introduced to that party, or that party hasn't found for the role, then and where there's no other obvious umbrella company in the chain, then that will be a purported umbrella company arrangement. And again, it depends on looking at the sort of factual analysis of what's going on in that supply chain. But in that scenario, it's more likely that the end client could be drawn into joint and several liability. So that is something to look at carefully, particularly in terms of checks that you were doing on supply chains in relation to use of umbrellas and possible identification of reported umbrella companies. And then the third case is where you've got an arrangement where a worker has got what they call a material interest in the company that's engaging them, and it would be reasonable to assume they were being paid as an employee. So again, that is intended to close down or at least bring arrangements where there is possibly undisclosed use of PSC arrangements behind an umbrella front into the new umbrella company tax legislation. So it's fairly dense, it's fairly complex, and as I say, I think it will have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. But it is really important to try and work out how it could potentially apply to parties in supply chains and arrangements for paying workers, because joint and several liability will still apply to purported umbrella companies in the same way as it does to umbrella companies. So you've got a little bit more of an unknown there that you've got to try and get to the bottom of, and that's another reason why a lot of the payslip checking arrangements services are not going to currently get to the bottom of this purported umbrella company challenge. It may be that over time that will, somebody will be able to put together checks that will be suited to that, but at the moment it's not a given that those purported umbrella companies would be identified by those checks. So another reason to proceed with caution on that front.
Yeah, no,
And
understood.
yeah, sorry, Dan.
All right, back to you.
I think I just wanted to clarify that where you have got a purported umbrella company, any of the income that's paid to the individual worker is that there is now a mechanism in this new legislation which basically deems that payment, that income, to be a deemed employment payment. So it'd be treated as earnings of an employment. So the fact that it may have been treated as a dividend or paid as a dividend will on the face of it not make any difference. We can totally anticipate, in years to come, some fairly interesting litigation around all of this, but at the moment we're having to kind of preempt all of that and do our best to help everybody put in place compliance checking and compliant arrangements that don't end up in the tax tribunals.
Yeah, and I was just coming in there just to reinforce that point, really. It's obvious when you start looking at these additional cases and they're trying to bring in now different types of remuneration, including, dividend remuneration, that HMRC are widening the remit here to include arrangements where workers are getting paid via PSE. So in your view, what HMR seeking to achieve with that? It looks like it's a direct response to cases like Ducas that people will be aware of.
I think, yes, that's almost certainly the case. I mean, obviously that's on ongoing litigation. We don't know what the outcome of that is going to be, but I think the purported umbrella company rules are definitely a response to arrangements that have been sold as one thing and then turn out to be something else, and Ducas appears to be a good example of that.
Yeah, agreed. Looks like we've managed to switch the Q&A on, folks, which is great. So I'll keep my eye both on the chat and the Q&A. So don't worry if you've already put questions in chat. I'll make sure we flick through both. Just important that you get your questions across so we can address them. And on that point, we had it in our form anyway, but someone's already asked. I could see what the impact could be here around CIS engagements, Francis. So what's your view on how CIS could interact with this?
I think again, on the face of it, a CIS payment arrangement would not fall within the definition of an umbrella company, because they are where you've got a CIS payment chain and payment of a CIS subcontractor. It's done so on the basis that subcontractor is self-employed, and they, all of the sort of things that you would associate with self-employment are relevant to that engagement. So it's not an employment situation. It's not the supply of somebody who is employed to work personally for a third party. However, because of the purported umbrella company rules, I think there is a risk that if CIS is used in an undisclosed way, possibly, I'm going to say behind the scenes, that sounds a bit cloak and dagger, but in a supply chain where perhaps the client has specified that everybody needs to be on PAYE, and all of the costings of that arrangement and chargings have been based on the assumption that all workers will be paid PAYE, and yet it turns out that further down the chain, some or all of the workers are actually paid self-employed through a CIS supply chain arrangement, then that could be enough to trigger purported company umbrella company liability. So I think the what we're saying is that, and hopefully a lot of CIS payment intermediaries do actually call themselves CIS umbrellas, so that's probably not very helpful. I think that probably needs to change pretty quickly, but I think it is going to be important to look at current arrangements in the supply chains that involve payments to CIS subcontractors, to just check that there isn't anything in there that basically assumes that they are PAYE, because that could become an issue that could trigger a purported umbrella company situation. And I think the sort of reverse of that is that if you do intend people to be paid self-employed CIS, there shouldn't be anything in those contracts and arrangements that suggests otherwise. So again, it's going to be a case of looking at what are you actually dealing with. Is there any issue or risk here that we need to take into account? So there's no kind of yes or no answer to that, I'm afraid. I think you need to look at what you're dealing with and who thinks what. So, what does the end client think? Do they know that these people have been paid CIS? If not, have they specified they should be PAYE? And that's certainly something that I've seen on some large construction projects. It's actually been specified that all workers should be PAYE. So that could create something that needs to be looked into quite carefully.
Yeah.
Sorry, my light's gone off.
No, it's okay. You have to shake your hair around and that'll switch it back on. There you go. I suppose the other scenario as well there would be, the workers are being sent to a provider who's supposed to be carrying out SDC checks as well as the other checks to ensure that worker is genuinely self-employed and can operate on a CIS basis. I suppose with the potential of that risk transferring back up the supply chain under this new Chapter 11, you just need to make sure that the onboarding checks are absolutely taking place. And like you say, clarity that if the intent is someone to be paid PAYE, then that needs to be followed through. But let's move on then. So just before we go on to the next topic, can you remind us again where the liability ultimately sits across the supply chain? So, for example, how should end hirers, MSPs, and agencies interpret their exposure under this joint and several liability? Are there any grey areas that you'd highlight as well?
Yes. So generally speaking, in most supply chains, joint several liability will be between the umbrella company and the agency, and the agency will be the agency that holds the contract with the client. MSPs that sit in the contractual supply chain are going to be sharing liability with umbrella companies in a lot of cases. But that's not exclusively the case. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there will be certain scenarios where the end client might be jointly and severally liable. And that could be where the agency that it contracts with is somehow connected to the umbrella company that's used to pay the workers. And that connection is, generally speaking, as a result of shared ownership or control. between the agency and the umbrella company. So there are some MSP groups, for instance, that have umbrella companies within their group. They would be connected. The other scenario would be where the agency is non-UK resident. I think that's probably less likely, but that is something to bear in mind. And also, if there is no agency between the end client and the umbrella company, or the purported umbrella company, then joint and several liability is shared between the end client and the umbrella company. So again, that's where it becomes quite important to identify any arrangement that could be a purported umbrella company that you previously assumed you didn't have an issue because, well, we've got no umbrella companies in our supply chains. Well, that have you got any purported umbrella companies in your supply chains? So that is going to be an area that we think is going to require quite a lot of scrutiny over the next couple of months. In terms of grey areas, that there will be grey areas, just as there is for the purposes of other employment tax legislation in this area, because a lot of this, as you can probably tell, depends on, well, who is the end client, who is the top agency, and you only know who the top agency is if you know who the end client is. So you have to be able to identify who those relevant parties are. And in some cases, that's not always clear, just as it's not always clear when you're looking at off payroll situations as well. So particularly in supply chains where you might have something that appears to be the supply of a managed service or an outsourced service or a statement of work, where the assumption or the proposition is that it's the company that is supplying to the organization at the top of the chain is actually the client, and then the supplying company actually supplies a service, not individuals for personal service, then that could shift the identity of the client for these purposes down a step in the supply chain. But all of that is going to, again, turn on the facts you have in a particular case. So that is definitely an area where we expect to see a few grey areas and head scratched as to who's liable here, and that will require a little bit more analysis. And I think that's inevitable as well, because we're definitely seeing renewed interest in statement of work again, partly as a response to this, and partly as a result of the sort of off payroll IR35 risk. So I think I would advise certainly end clients and agencies not to take statement of work or managed service or outsourced service arrangements at face value. You need to look a little bit more deeper to work out whether they are in fact what they say they are.
Yeah, no, and you've done a good job there of highlighting it's very complex, isn't it? So many different ways that workers can be engaged and work can be delivered. And I think you made a good point as well around the ownership of these companies, and you need to check that in case there's some involvement that will have an impact on where that liability sits in certain supply chains. Before we move on then to the last topic, do you think we're expecting any further operational guidance from HMRC between now and April, or do you think we've got what we've got and we need to crack on?
I mean, I don't think we may do. I don't know. There may be some technical guidance that's issued possibly once the legislation comes into effect. I don't know. I'll be guessing.
Yeah.
We've obviously got the government's more general guidance on the new rules. HMRC will probably issue some of its own kind of employment status type or guidance, but yeah, I haven't got a date for that yet. But just we'll let you know if as soon as that comes out, it will be shared around, I'm sure.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, let's move move on, conscious of time. So we're on to the second topic now, which are just talking about some of the wider implications that the legislation could have, such as the impact on funding availability, insurance availability, and possibly knock-on impact on M&A activity in the recruitment space. So, as we know, Francis, legislation can often have unintended or indirect consequences. When trying to solve one issue, obviously there can be an impact on another. So in your opinion, are there any other commercial impacts that you'd highlight to the audience that could come in as a result of joint and several liability?
I think it's inevitable this is going to, change and shake up a lot of current arrangements that have, for various reasons become quite reliant on use of umbrella companies, many of whom are not dodgy, but unfortunately in certain areas there has been reliance on this. And I think one thing that we're likely to see changing here is a significant reduction, if not the phasing out of umbrella companies offering basically cheap what is actually credit to agencies. And I think that will leave some agencies in a difficult position because they'll need to secure more expensive sort of cash flow funding. I think that's a reality of these supply chains because, a lot of end user clients do not pay on a pay cycle that allows the agencies and umbrella companies to pay weekly or even monthly in some cases, so that there is a cash flow credit need in these supply chains. So if umbrella companies can no longer provide that, either because they can no longer afford to, or there is this concern about joint and several liability, you as an agency, you probably don't want to be using an umbrella company that is extending credit or extended payment terms to a lot of other agencies, because that's going to put them at a commercial risk and potentially lead to you with joint and several liability for any tax default. So that, I think, is going to change, and I think it is already changing. I think we're going to start to see some smaller umbrella companies go into insolvency. Again, we've started to see that as well, and I think we'll see that increasing significantly in the run up to next April. As Dan mentioned, I think I'm hearing that asset-based lenders are pretty jumpy about this legislation. They don't like the joint several liability risk that it presents. So you may find that this type of lending or facility is either going to be harder to secure or is going to be more expensive. So I think what all of this is pointing towards a consolidation. Certainly in the sort of umbrella market, there will be a move of market share towards those probably larger umbrella companies that can demonstrate compliance, have proven track record, trading record, and strong balance sheet. I mean, I think the financial due diligence side of things is just as important as anything you do with pay slips. You need to make sure you're dealing with an established business. I think in some supply chains, we may start to see a movement to sort of margin-only arrangements. MSPs have got quite a big challenge in all of this. So they may want to take themselves out of the supply chain, or they may want to take second-tier suppliers out of the contractual supply chain. So there are different ways of doing that. So I think, there are options there that will be considered, and some of them will be implemented, even though we're now looking at 4 months to get that done. But I think we are starting to see some changes around that. And I think, use of umbrella companies, or again, this purported umbrella company risk, staffing supply chains generally are definitely already a key due diligence area for any kind of sale process. You may say there's not a lot of M&A going on in the sector at the moment, but certainly anybody who's gearing up to be in pole position to be the one that's the best option when things pick up, they need to make sure they haven't got any umbrella company risk in their supply chains, because that is going to be a value issue. So this isn't just about HMRC bringing assessment, regulators challenging what's going on. It's also a sort of enterprise value issue as well, protecting that value, not adding more risk into the equation.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I just think from my side, obviously being in the umbrella market, those points that Francis are making, I'm absolutely seeing on the ground now. So, they recruitment businesses, particularly the MSPs, generally speaking, are looking at reducing the PSLs and then mandating those reduced PSLs down their supply chains to the second tier recruitment agencies that supply in. So that logically has a knock-on impact on this consolidation point. I think there'll be many small to medium-sized, well-run, compliant umbrella companies that unfortunately are going to see reduced volumes of workers because of the tightening of these PSLs. And if you're not one of the 5 or 6 that appear on those, then it's going to be really tough trading conditions. And obviously, once an umbrella company loses workers, they lose margin. But also, to your point, Francis, there's less PAYE and VAT, which generally generates the cash flow that's often used to lend to recruitment businesses to provide those payment terms that you mentioned. So I think you can speculate and see quite quickly post-April, there's likely to be a pretty rapid consolidation of the market. Different businesses at different stages in this process as well. So some recruitment businesses are very much parking this as a sort of Q1 next year issue, and they'll start thinking about it in January, and others have already moved to select who the PSL is that they want to work with. And that's having an impact on some workers, and we're seeing some of that movement now. So I think the general message is this is coming, and we've got the final legislations, and it is time to take some action. And on that, moving through the topics, Francis, what should companies be doing now to prepare?
Okay, well, obviously with 4 months to go, there is a fair amount to do. And if you haven't started to do so already, I think it's going to be important for all parties in staffing supply chain to start to review and identify where they're using umbrella companies. And then they're also going to have to start thinking about, are there any potential purported umbrella companies in arrangements, particularly where they think they don't have any umbrella companies. I think that is going to become an exercise for some that is going to be a little bit more involved than perhaps they might expect or want it to be. I think MSPs and agencies, a lot of them have already started carrying out compliance checks on umbrellas, and as Dan says, moving towards identifying who they would like to put on preferred supplier lists. And that will involve, and already is involving, using payslip checking services, credit checking arrangements, and also the trade body, like FCSA accreditation, etc. But it is going to be a case of working out what can we sensibly check, what's going to provide us with useful information. And the other side to that is making sure that compliance teams within agencies, MSPs in particular, understand what the checks are disclosing, and perhaps also what they're not showing. I think that there's still going to be quite a big role for compliance teams in this. It's not going to be enough just to say, okay, we've got this checking service, or we've got some kind of insurance-backed arrangement here. I think compliance teams are still going to need to understand what they're looking at in order to address to map out the risk and then put appropriate risk management precautions in place. So that's all about deciding on, what is it going to be your policy for either allowing use of umbrella companies in your supply chains or not. How is that going to be implemented and communicated through supply chains? And I think, what sometimes gets lost in in all of this, I know it's a very real practical issue on the ground, but what we're talking about here is people, these are workers, and it is going to take quite a long time once you've decided what we're actually dealing with. How do we want to deal with this? It's going to take a lot of time to communicate with workers that you may want to require to no longer use certain umbrella companies and to use new umbrella companies going forward. How do you do that? It's probably best to wait until current assignments have come to an end rather than terminate assignments and then require them to be sort of moved across. But all of that needs to be done quite carefully, and there will be some resistance in all of this from the actual workers themselves. So starting with communications around what's going to happen and why is going to take time, and I build in time to deal with complications and objections to changing umbrella companies. That needs to be factored into this 4 months. And then obviously any contracts, I mean, all of these supply chains operate with sort of legal contracts underlying and dictating who does what and who's responsible for what, and contractually who's liable for what. To the extent that any of this changes the contractual position, those are going to have to be negotiated and they're implemented in those contracts. So yes, there is a lot to do, but it is achievable. I think the main thing is to sort of work out first what are we dealing with, and then form a plan from there. We probably will see some knee-jerk reactions from end users where they say no umbrella companies. That's exactly what happened with off payroll. That isn't necessarily going to get to a point of a compliant staffing supply chain, not least because of the purported umbrella company rules. So yeah, I would strongly advise anybody who does use contingent workers to start looking at their staffing supply chains in light of these changes as soon as possible.
Plenty of work to do, so time's of the essence. And speaking of time, I'm very conscious that we need to make sure that we leave some time for questions from the audience. So I think we're just going to move on now to our final topic, Francis, just quickly covering off the wider employment rights bill. Obviously, we had an update from the government recently about the revision of the unfair dismissal provisions. But can you summarise very quickly what we know about the ERB and how it's shaping up in the timeframes, and then we'll start to work through the Q&A.
Yeah, so I think we thought we would just clarify the position on this, because what we've been talking about is the tax legislation that's going to affect umbrella company arrangements. Alongside that, but completely separately, we have the proposals coming out of the Employment Rights Bill, and there's many of those, but some of them will directly impact agency workers and umbrella company workers. And in addition to that, there is a proposal to extend the definition of employment business in the Employment Rights Bill to expressly pull in umbrella companies to regulation under the conduct regulations, the recruitment regulations in the UK. So we just thought it would be useful to flag that this is kind of happening alongside. The two definitions of umbrella company, or in the case of the ERB, the employment business, are not the same. They are different definitions. I mean, they may lead to the same types of arrangement, and certainly the definition of employment business has been extended to include what have I got here? Arrangements, employment arrangements, it's called, under which persons who are or are intended to be in the employment of a person. So that is kind of similar to the purported umbrella company arrangements that we've mentioned already, but it is different. And obviously the conduct regs is an entirely separate piece of legislation to the tax side of things. So there is going to be more to report on this in the next year or so. We haven't yet seen the consultation on changes to the conduct regs, which will include this employment business point, but we expect to see them probably in the new year, if not before the end of this year. The main sticking point, as reported, was the day one unfair dismissal rights being changed to 6 months. So all indications are that now that that has been resolved, the consultations will take place. But we don't have a date for those yet. But when they do happen again, I'm sure we'll be reporting on those. One thing that may happen, and we've seen rumours of, is that because of the change in the definition of employment business, it may no longer be possible for umbrella company contractors to opt out of the conduct regs, which would make sense because they want to bring them within the scope of the conduct regs. But that's to be confirmed. But that detail will be in the consultations that we've yet to see.
Great. Never a dull moment in this space on legislation, and always plenty coming down the pipe. Francis, thank you. That brings us to an end of the formal topics and questions. So as anticipated, loads of questions in the Q&A and chat for us to work through. And if we don't get to all the questions, guys, then what we'll tend to do is do a follow-up, and we'll include the answers to the ones that we can't get to when we send out the recording at the end. But let's see how we go. So first question was from Graham. We are a recruitment company and insist on umbrella companies that our contractors wish to use being FCSA accredited. But as I understand it, as an example, if Giant was to get the PAYE and or the NI deductions wrong, then both Giant and ourselves could be held joint liable for any underpayments. Is that correct? So the short answer to that, Graham, is yes, that is correct. I mean, in reality, if we were to make a mistake or do a wrong deduction, we would rectify that in the course of business. But you are right, that does create a liability joint and several between Giant in this scenario and your recruitment business. That's exactly what the legislation's aiming at. Unless
you're in a supply chain and you are a second tier supplier into an MSP. Yes, and in that scenario, it would be the MSP who's joining severally liable with Giant. Yeah,
good point. So again, we said it at the top of the session, didn't we? Just being FCSA accredited or being professional passport and safe rec or whatever, these are all mitigations of risk, but are not removing that risk. Okay, so on to the next one for you, Francis. Let's bear with me. And I'm happy to comment on this as well. What are your thoughts? This is from Nicola. What are your thoughts on the Fortis model with professional passport? Does this protect the agency as we would be paying the PAYE and NI directly? So have you got any views on that?
Well, I obviously can't comment on the Fortis model per se, but I understand it's a model whereby the tax and NI is calculated and paid by the agency rather than the umbrella company, so that payment is paid directly to HMRC, and that's based on the fact that the agency will have actually discharged that PAYE liability. It's not making a payment of the tax to an umbrella company. So in that sense, it does take that agency out of joint and several liability because they have paid it and they can demonstrate that tax has been accounted for directly.
Yeah, and I'd just add into that, and I have spoken to Crawford about the model, so I've got a good understanding. I think from a technical perspective, it could work because the agency is covering its liability by paying that payment direct to HMRC. The challenge with it, though, is that from a joint and several liability perspective, the risk is now flipped. So from Giant's perspective, if we were to engage on that across the 1,000 or so recruitment agencies that we engage with, we're now reliant on 1,000 recruitment agencies paying that PAYE liability on our PAYE ref over to HMRC. So it works from an agency's perspective, but from an umbrella perspective, it's still risky. My understanding, we're not, I don't think we will be signing up to that model from Giant's perspective because we're not prepared to take that risk. My understanding is that most of the larger umbrella companies are of the similar sort of mind. So what could be an outcome is that the providers that are happy to engage on that basis may be some of these smaller providers that we're referring to. So you just need to think about, the quality of the provider that's still in the supply chain. We haven't seen loads of traction with the model in the market, but I do know that there's been a couple of end clients that have taken a look at it. So again, it's the risk is just reversed basically. So you've got financial risk, but it's now reversed out of the agency and down to the umbrellas. So that's something you need to think about. Question from Lorraine. What would you advise us as a company that engages workers to a third party and pays via umbrella to check now audit pay slips? Question. Well, I think we covered a lot of this off, didn't we, Francis, in the questions, but just simply auditing the pay slips. You can do all the due diligence in the world, but you're not going to remove this liability, I'm afraid. So it's back to the meat and bones of what we were talking about, which is, if you're going to make a decision to use an umbrella company, do your due diligence for sure, but equally you need to be paying attention to the financial stability of those payroll companies, and where possible, keeping that PSL as short as you possibly can, Lorraine. Or if you're really uncomfortable with the risk, then maybe PAYE yourselves as an agency is an option. Francis, if you've got anything else to add there?
I think it's the financial standing checks are going to be just as important that I mentioned. So what is the trading history? Make sure they've got one. It's not a brand new company. It's just been set up to do something. I don't know what it is, but if they've got no trading record, that's never a good sign. I'm not saying it necessarily means they're dodgy. It's harder for them to prove that they have historically complied with all of their PAY obligations. Make sure that they have a strong balance sheet. I mean, in all of this, we're talking about different levels of potential liability. There could be at the one end of the scale, business changing levels of liability, and the other end of the scale, there is going to be sort of technical defaults or small discrepancies that technically lead to joint several liability, but which the umbrella company is going to be able to and would expect to cover payment of. And you need to make sure they're not trading in a situation where they wouldn't be able to cover smaller levels of liability as a matter of course. So any umbrella company that you think is not going to withstand any kind of financial blow, I would say is one that you shouldn't be dealing with.
Yeah, and I think just as a positive message, like just to reinforce, there are, despite the bad press that the term umbrella company gets by a lot of these bad actors that have been in the market, there are a whole range, including Giant, of stable, financially secure, compliant umbrellas that have been operating in these supply chains for many decades now. So it's some of the risks that we're talking about under joint and several liability around business failure. This is not new. These have always been risks. So it's about using the established providers, financial health, limiting your risk where you can by just limiting the number and controlling the number that pop up in the supply chain. And then it should be business as usual if you've picked the right providers. Time for a few more questions. So one from Chris. What advice should recruitment businesses be giving their clients in relation to good practice and limiting liability? So I think that's an interesting one, Chris, because I think still many businesses from an end hirer perspective are unaware of these changes and need engaging on it. So Francis, if you want to start on that, what would you recommend the messaging should be from recruiters to their end hirers in relation to what is good practice and limiting liability?
I mean, I think ideally it would be at least a discussion at this early stage to look at how supplies are set up, you know, just to make sure that use of umbrella companies is transparent, you know, that they know that they're there and that you've taken measures to ensure that this doesn't give rise to risk, certainly for the recruitment agency. I mean, the end clients been not even if technically it's not in the joint and several liability frame, it's not really going to want to deal with an agency that could be pushed into insolvency by a tax liability. You know, that creates difficulties for an end client, both business interruption, possible commercial risk, financial risk, where people are left unpaid as a result, and also reputationally. So I think it's an opportunity in a way for recruitment businesses to have an open conversation with clients who are willing to engage, and I accept that's not always the case, but you know, I would encourage them to do so, because it's important that everybody knows, and certainly HMRC has been putting out guidance on this for several years now. End clients and everybody in staffing supply chains is expected to know who's involved in those supplies, what each party does, and ultimately who pays the workers and on what basis. So it is in end clients' interest to understand that and have discussions around that as well, because you know, this new umbrella legislation is not the only game in town. There are other reasons why end clients should look into that and be concerned about it. So it should be part of their reasonable procedures in relation to failure to prevent facilitation of tax avoidance, and for larger clients, failure to prevent fraud. Certainly, staffing supply chains is an area that requires a risk assessment, and HMRC have made that very clear. They expect staffing supplies to be part of CFA reasonable procedures. So this isn't just about the umbrella legislation. There are other reasons why they need to be aware of the risks here and be reassured that you are going to be able to help them or manage those risks. So as I say, it could be an opportunity as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think we've certainly on these series of webinars we've been doing over many years, Francis, we've been banging the drum about compliance, and now joint and several liability really wakens everyone up to that risk. So actually there's huge value add for recruitment businesses, MSPs now, to shield their end hirers from risk by taking compliance seriously and, you know, making sure that they're protecting the customers as a result. So I think that can only strengthen the client proposition and the conversation and what you're delivering as a service at the end of the day. So I think viewing it in that positive light, it's a reason for a recruitment agency to be involved in that supply chain to help de-risk. And obviously, as you also make the point in another question, if clients directly with an umbrella and an agency steps in there, then technically the joint and several liability then sits between the agency and the umbrella. So there's certainly a role for recruiters to play in de-risking their clients. Time for, well, in fact, we've just run out of time, haven't we? Actually, we've hit a hard stop at 1, and there's still many questions in there. So I think we'll take a stop, but we will cover off some of those additional questions in our follow-up once Francis and I have got a chance to read them through. Francis, thank you again for your time. That was really excellent. Really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. As I said, we will follow up with the recording, and those unanswered questions we'll get to. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon and is looking forward to Christmas. It will be here soon. See you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.